Good afternoon from Brussels. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, president of GMF, acting president, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to what is in fact our first in-person, or at least hybrid, event in Brussels since the start of the pandemic. And so a very big thank you to all of you for coming, a special thank you really today. This is a very big room. It's actually not so small a group, but it's in a very big room. And we have also a much larger online audience with us of 200 or so. So a very big welcome to all who've joined us on both sides of the Atlantic online. Let me just say that the topic that we're going to talk about today, democratic resilience, and the project that goes along with this, and we'll introduce that in a moment, clearly the whole question of resilience was on all of our agendas even before the pandemic. In a political sense, in the context of health security and many, many other things. But today we're going to talk about the political dimension. It's a critical question in Europe, it's a critical question for the United States, and it's an important set of issues for GMF. And we're doing work on this front in various ways, through our policy work, but also through our civil society work, and other things that GMF does on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's a great pleasure today to be able to talk to you about some initial results from an ongoing project on democratic resilience, an index of democratic resilience. And we're most grateful to the partners in this activity, to the European Commission, to DG NEAR, to the U.S. Agency for International Development, and to the GlobalFocus Center, who helped us make this project a reality. It's also a really great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Alina Inaya, who runs our Bucharest office, but is also the director of our Black Sea Trust, and has helped lead this work. And I'm going to introduce her to start us off and to tell us more in some detail about the project and its findings, and then we're going to have a conversation about them after that. But again, thank you all very much for joining us here and online, and we look forward to seeing you again at GMF in person or online soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian, for this wonderful introduction. I will not talk about the project in detail because you have a full panel of people who worked very hard on this project to do so. I just want to say two things about this initiative. First of all, the nicety of it is that it's a transatlantic initiative. It is being funded, has been funded by both USAID, so the United States government, and also the Directorate General NEAR, DG NEAR here at the European Commission. So when it comes to funding, it really brought the two sides of the Atlantic together, which is one of the things that GMF does so wonderfully. The second thing about the project is that even if it's about resilience, it's about democratic resilience, it started before the pandemic started. It started before all the talk about resilience started. It actually started when things were going pretty badly, both in Hungary and Poland, and we were scratching our heads, still are, but anyway, what to do about it and how to make sure that societies do not implode under illiberalism pressure. So for us and for the people, for the team who worked on this project, resilience is not only a buzzword, it's something that it has been taken very, very seriously, as you will see. My mission here was to introduce the funders so they could tell you a little bit about why they fund these projects and what they like about these projects. Unfortunately, one of the funders, those who are representing DG NEAR, could not join us today for very objective reasons. But we do have here, here online, obviously, in the virtual space, the representative from USAID, Suren Avanesian, who is the Chief of Democracy and Governance Division at USAID. Suren, I hope you can see us and hear us. Hi, and please go ahead and, well, first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And please tell us what you like about this project, why did you fund it, and in general, how exceptional it is. Thank you.
Anytime, Alina. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this important forum. USAID and German Marshall Fund, our partnership has been very productive and lasted for many, many years, including 13 years with BST, and we're very happy about that. And the partnership resulted in a number of very strong initiatives, one of which is the new Democratic Resilience Index that was put together by GlobalFocus. When we think of indices and what they do, especially in the field of democracy, what we're really looking for is a rigorous scientific attempt to look at the data and help us track developments in civil society, help us track democratic developments writ large. And it's important to us as a funder, as a donor, for a variety of different reasons. We use indices to design our new programs and think what those programmatic approaches may look like going forward. We use this information and data in our conversations with the appropriators when we think of the budgets and the funds that we actually need to maintain and expand this important work. And also it gives us an idea about the overall democratic trajectory in many of the societies where we're involved with you, with our partners in this important work. Now, indices add kind of unique value to what we do in the way we think of the whole enterprise of democracy. And at this point, perhaps it could be difficult to come up with some new innovative approach, especially when it comes to assessing and tracking democratic developments and whatnot. And after reviewing the Democracy Resilience Index, it is clear to us that the index is offering a new and very much needed and timely approach to assessing democratic developments and the overall democratic resilience at this very important juncture when it comes to maintaining and sustaining and expanding democracy in a very difficult environment. Now, from our experiences working with a variety of different tools that are out there available to us, we know that there are some inevitable handicaps when it comes to measuring democracy, right? And one of them is the significant lag of time that occurs between the time the data gets collected and then processed and then is made available to the public. But also there are very few tools where in the field of democratic kind of assessing democratic developments and processes and whatnot, we also have a chance to look at economic developments. We also look at external factors that affect the democratic developments in a given country, but also tools that allow us to look at various internal developments in a society that inevitably affect the way democracy consolidates in a given country. And looking at the index that we're discussing today, it fills that important gap because it allows to the policymakers, to the think tank community, academics, but also democracy practitioners such as ourselves. It allows us to have a tool that serves as an early warning mechanism that allow us to be more proactive. It allows us to anticipate negative developments and adjust in a way that we're ready to intervene and adjust our approaches and thinking in a way that we can effectively address those negative developments. And, you know, as you correctly pointed out, the exact reasons for democratic backsliding and the breakthroughs in a given country, why they occurs, you know, it occurs here but not there, that discussion is still taking place. It is still very much underway. And then the why part, you know, there's no particular consensus on that issue right now. But what is clear also is that there's an enormous wealth of information and data that is out there and available. And this particular index aggregates this data and thinks about this in a way that is particularly helpful to us, again, as the premier US government agency working in democracy assistance and so forth. And we're hoping that as the tool develops, it will help us to answer the question of why, but also will help us to develop the types of programs that are better suited to a very challenging environment, but also gives us an opportunity to better understand developments in countries and how we can be helpful. It was a great pleasure to read the index. It was exactly what I expected to be, and congratulations on that. And I congratulate GlobalFocus on first identifying this gap, but also coming up with a solution. And I look forward to the discussion today. And thanks again for having me here. And again, just to reiterate how pleased we are to be a part of this effort and support German Marshall Fund in this important endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Søren, for your very nice words. You said that this is a tool that EU can use to strengthen democracies in its member countries, but also this is something that we hope that US will also be able to use once we expand the index to the US, which I'm pretty sure Juana already has in mind. With this, my very easy mission today is over. I pass on the baton to Juana, who's going to moderate the panel and actually explain what the index is all about. Thank you very much, and Juana, please, let's switch places.
Thank you very much, Alina. I wish to thank not just the GMF, although I do have to thank them, and not just for the financial support, but also for really coming up with the request that we elaborate this Democratic Resilience Index, based on our previous experience with the Propaganda Permeability Index, which we first did. And that was when we started identifying, I think it was around 2017, we started identifying the fact that most of the threats of our time are probably not going to come in the conventional shape of conflict, war, or territorial annexation and border change, which we still see, unfortunately. But there are many other more surreptitious methods of making sure that our societies are undermined from within. And so, since that was a partnership with the GMF as well, they were kind enough to request from us that we elaborate this Democratic Resilience Index. And I'm also happy that hopefully the partnership with the European Commission will mean that decision makers will take this instrument on board, because I think we see loud and clear, if I may say so, how much there is a need for targeted interventions that really look at the country context when addressing domestic vulnerabilities as well as external interference. Let me try to get the clicker. I hope this works. And if we can have the first presentation, that's up now? So let me start by saying, first of all, how we thought of the entire framework for this index. Essentially, we started from the idea that for a good while after the Cold War, the common belief was that you could only have either authoritarian, autocratic countries or countries that were or would be democratic. What we have found out the hard way in the meantime is that this is actually an oversimplification, and that there's a whole range of options in between the two. Many countries about to democratize stop somewhere on the path to full democratization. Others backslide and reverse to a pre-democratic state. what we had in mind when we built this was therefore how to predict backsliding and how to identify the resilience drivers that would actually, if encouraged, if investment, not just financial, but of all sorts, is made in key areas, might help against democratic backsliding. What kind of signs should we look for, as has been said here, in an early warning mechanism to know when there are signs for alarm? So the Democratic Resilience Index is precisely that, an early warning mechanism. It seeks to indicate movement, and it looks at the main factors pertaining to democratic resilience. What it doesn't do, unlike existing indexes, which we have very much made use of in our methodology, is it doesn't look at the quality of democracy. There are better indexes that do that. It looks at the resilience per se. So you could have one country which is democratically quite advanced, but is showing signs of backsliding, and then its resilience is not so strong. You could also have a country that's still not fully democratized, but what there is sustainable and solid. I'm going to go very fast through these few slides because Dani, who is the research lead and has very much coordinated the methodology, will explain it at large. But we have 4 dimensions of analysis across 4 categories of factors. I won't go through them because you can all read them on the slides. This is what the final matrix looks like, and whoever is interested can access it on our website. You will have it at the very end, where you can see the full study and you can understand in depth exactly what we have looked for every step of the way. And I will then jump directly to the results, which right now are for Romania, Hungary, and the Republic of Moldova. This is essentially a pilot project. We are definitely looking to expand it to as many countries as possible, not just in the European neighborhood, but also within the EU. And let me say, the fact that we have focused on Central Eastern Europe this time is not because we believe that Central Eastern Europe is the only one that's suffering from signs of backsliding. That is absolutely not the case, and I think the degree of democratic resilience is something to worry about in all of our democracies. But for now, these are the countries that we have chosen to make sure that we have all categories represented. Countries that are EU and NATO members and countries that aren't. Countries that are about to become full-fledged democracies and countries that are trying to consolidate existing democracies. And you can see here the results, the quantitative results show Romania in the best position of the 3. And then you can see perhaps not surprisingly to some of you, Hungary and Moldova scoring quite similar on average, although Moldova is more homogeneous in terms of the spread across all the dimensions of analysis. I will just go through a few of the main findings to give you a glimpse of what that kind of instrument can reveal about a country. I will tell you that, as you can see on the diagram, we have taken into consideration structural factors, meaning the degree of institutionalization, if you want, or factors pertaining to institutionalization. We have looked at elite agency, that is the individuals, whether decision makers or other influencers, and we have looked at crisis buffers and triggers. So elements that don't necessarily pertain to the 2 categories or do belong in one, but we identify them as specifically prone to triggering potential crisis, or on the contrary, being elements that, should an attempt to reverse democratization, let's say, happen, they would help guard against it. In this respect, we have found that institutional and structural factors are better consolidated in Romania. It scores highest on external affairs. Perhaps that doesn't correlate just by accident with the fact that it's been consistently one of the most pro-EU, pro-NATO countries in the region. And in terms of its economy, it scores the lowest in institutional structural framework. For Hungary and Moldova, media and civil society score highest. And in Hungary, the political environment and external affairs scores the lowest. So these are essentially its main vulnerabilities. Media and civil society is the main strength in both Moldova and Hungary. In terms of elite agency, we see that it tends to be rather heterogeneous, and I think that is an interesting find, because we very much look these days at the role that political personalities have in determining the fate of a country whose society might otherwise not necessarily be fully aligned with its political representatives, because we often think, well, they have voted them in office, hence that is the leadership they deserve. And sometimes we find that leaders score, so to speak, differently than society overall in terms of democratic resilience. Elite agency, we find, is quite consistent with how countries have scored on crisis triggers and buffers, which might be something to further look into. And one other thing that I believe is of interest, especially here in Brussels, is that external affairs has been found across the board to be both an important trigger and buffer for all the countries. And you will see that in more detail when we get to this specific sector. Obviously, you don't need to read through all this, but if this is just to give you a glimpse of the dimensions that we have analyzed, there are 90 variables overall. Everywhere, whether it's a positive or a negative dimension, and by that I mean positive means we have looked at factors that are conducive to democratic resilience, such as the democratic values of business elites, let's say. And then negative, when I say negative, I mean we have looked at things, I think there are about 30 variables in all, that are obstacles on the way to democratic resilience, such as the influence of non-democratic external actors. So a high score, it means the country scores well on democratic resilience. A low score means it scores rather badly. We have got these results through expert surveys. We have applied expert surveys because we have considered that it is stakeholders who are involved in various fields of life, from politics to media to business to think tanks, NGOs and whatnot, that have the most accurate assessment of the situation at hand. And these are essentially the results that we have obtained. This is the same thing, but simplified for you to see in red the areas of alarm, let's say. So wherever you see red, that means that is where these countries have the most salient problems. Green is where they score best. So again, this is just an easier way for you to visualize the situation at hand. And now to go to what we found these countries to have in common. In terms of vulnerabilities, political clientelism is a very common feature to all the three. Politicization of the media, social polarization, the low level of political activism, so citizens' involvement in politics, the poor quality of human resources in government structures, and the high labor market vulnerabilities. In terms of common resilience drivers, as you can read them, open and unrestricted access to internet has been found to be an important one. Popular support for international organizations, and that means the European Union, the UN, NATO, in any shape or form. The positive role of economic integration and widespread support for liberal values within society. The variations that we have seen, and here are just a few examples for you to see. If you look in the respective tables, you will obviously find a lot more, are things like in Romania, what comes across as most striking, perhaps, is the low influence of non-democratic actors, the strong alignment with international rules, so both domestic politics and foreign policy conducted in a way that follows the rules-based international order, whereas in Hungary we see a high influence of non-democratic actors and poor alignment with international rules. In Romania, we have low public support for foreign authoritarian leaders, whereas in Moldova, we have high public support for the same. And that means, you know, I'm sure it correlates with the questions that you well know from other surveys, such as what you think of Vladimir Putin and so on and so forth. This is just a glimpse of the sectorial democratic resilience drivers. You see Romania scoring highest on external affairs, as I was saying, with Hungary and Moldova again scoring highest on external affairs, but much lower than Romania. Hungary scoring lowest on political, and Moldova fairly homogeneous, as I was saying. And now going sector by sector, I think the main things that we see in Romania are the importance of free and fair elections, unlike in Hungary, where that is actually a minus. So a plus means positive, minus means negative. Political behaviors and norms influenced by liberal democratic and international actors, whether international organizations or states, and that is a plus in Romania, a minus in Hungary and Moldova. Low influence of extremist parties in Romania and Moldova, high influence of extremist parties in Hungary. And then you see a list per country of where countries have scored lowest and highest, and there is no need for me to go through them. You can see them. In terms of social environment, again, perhaps an underestimated aspect, the open and unrestricted access to internet is a very important democratic resilience driver. It seems to be quite easy to start a media outlet or a blog. There is more freedom of speech, there is more media pluralism in Romania and Moldova than there is in Hungary, whereas at the same time you have high politicization of the media, poor media independence, and high social polarization in all three countries. In terms of external affairs, the field that's been found to be most influential in the direction of democratic resilience, again, you see Romania scoring quite high on most dimensions, with the exception of the politicization of diplomatic appointments, which has been considered to be somewhere below average by respondents. In Hungary, you see that the main problems are the fact that decision makers don't prioritize democratic norms and behaviors over transactional politics, poor alignment with international rules, and so on and so forth. Again, you all can see them. In Moldova, one of the resilience drivers is the consistent presence of international organizations and their investment in democratic resilience, whereas one of the highest vulnerabilities is this large popular support for authoritarian leaders. In the economic sector, again, you see a number of elements, whereas in Romania, we see the absence of currency fluctuations as being a driver of resilience. In Hungary, it is quite the opposite. It's rather a vulnerability. We see the the politicization of public procurement as being a vulnerability in all three countries, especially in Hungary and Moldova. Quite on the contrary, we see economic integration as being a driver of democratic resilience in all three. And again, a common problem that we see is structural labor market problems, and that ranges from the absence of highly skilled workers to young people who cannot find jobs, to the high employment in subsistence farming and so on. Obviously, whether the economic outlook is poor or positive or negative, that has also a very important impact. This is again just to visualize the types of democratic resilience drivers. In Romania and Hungary, essentially from among the four institutional, elite, buffers and crisis triggers, the one that's helping hold things in place, as it were, is the institutional structural field, whereas the strongest in Moldova is elite agency. So it's rather the willpower of the leaders that's important and influences the direction that the country takes, rather than the structural arrangements that have been created across the years. Elite agency is weakest in Hungary. So again, we see the importance of leaders on democratic resilience, and strongest in Romania. Crisis triggers are stronger than buffers in Moldova and in Romania, while both in Moldova and Hungary, they score lower than in Romania. There's still crisis triggers are stronger, so that might spell trouble for the near future, whereas buffers are stronger than crisis triggers in Hungary, perhaps unexpectedly, but that is essentially a strength of the system, which can ensure to some extent that the democratic backsliding that we see taking place is limited by certain factors. You have here a few of the key buffers against democratic backsliding in Romania, Moldova, and Hungary. And you have a few of the strong crisis triggers. No need for me to go through them, but I think when we look at the political representation, not just of these countries, but of any country, in terms of how well citizens feel that they really have an impact on decision-making in their country through their elected representatives, I think it's worth looking at the high social polarization that we see, the low social collaboration in crisis, low political activism. These are triggers in Moldova, but we find them also in other countries. And I think it speaks, this is obviously a qualitative analysis that needs to be added on top of this quantitative instrument. But I think what we see is that in terms of democratic resilience writ large, we are witnessing a decrease in actual political representation, so that the connection between the public agenda and the political agenda is to some extent lost, and that essentially causes people to lose trust in democracy per se as a system, not just in their leaders. This is also just a glimpse of the institutional, structural, democratic resilience drivers, because most democracy-building projects have focused a lot on creating the institutions that will help make democracy sustainable. And I think this tells us a little bit about the areas where either we have not insisted enough, or there has been some backsliding in various cases. I will end by saying that what emerges from the 90 elements that we have considered are also clusters of variables, meaning factors that pertain to these three large categories, let's say. Stakeholder influence across all different sectors. And in terms of policy recommendations, because we do hope that our instrument is going to be used to perfect country-by-country targeted interventions in support of democracy, perhaps this is one of the things for decision makers to take into account, which is how much stakeholders invested in democratic processes can influence them. And so perhaps try to look more also to the respective stakeholders and not just to the institutions. You know, in line with the first ones, the stakeholders' commitment to liberal values across all different sectors, and again, I think this is an overlooked aspect many times. We see that I'm going to go a little bit beyond the scope of this project, but we are thinking of applying it in the Western Balkans, and I think we see that in the enlargement process, the European Union has tended to work a lot with the governments of these countries, governments which have become increasingly autocratic and have been losing legitimacy in front of their own people, rather than working with society at large, which in many cases we have found in the Western Balkans to be more liberally inclined than the actual leaders. And then finally, politicization across all different sectors, which I think comes as no surprise. This is what you see in terms of stakeholder influence as a driver of democratic resilience. And I encourage you to go through the study on the website if you want to see this in more detail. Same for stakeholders' commitment to liberal values. You will see elements such as communist melancholia, which has not scored very highly in these three countries, but we expect that to be the case in many other countries in the region where we expect to expand the index. Politicization is the last one. And this is just for you to see the scores together by sectors, first of all, of democratic resilience drivers, and then by types of democratic resilience drivers. And I will end by saying this was supposed to give you just a kind of a bird's eye view into this instrument. You will have a lot more granular details in the actual study on our website. And again, this is to say this is the work of a pretty large team. You have only some of it here, some on stage, and Costin Ciobanu, Andrei Tiut, and Clara Volintidu and are in the room and can also take your questions. Clara is actually the one who has coordinated the analysis of the results. And this is also a very diverse team, not just in terms of being from Romania, Moldova, and Hungary, but also in terms of what the team members specialize in, and they range from foreign policy and security to economics to sociology, political analysis, and whatnot, even electoral campaigning and electoral marketing. So we are quite confident that this is at least a very good start. We hope to further refine this instrument, also following your feedback, if you would kindly like to offer some. And hopefully we will meet again perhaps next year to see the updated results. This would be expanded again to as many countries as possible, but also repeated ideally every 2 years, because actually the most accurate results will be seen when we are able not just to compare countries against one another, because this makes less sense from the perspective of resilience, but to actually compare a country with itself the way it was 2 years ago, and then see if there is any sort of movement. With that, I will close here and apologize for this lengthy introduction, but it was to get you an idea of what the instrument can do. And I will introduce my colleagues, Dani Sandu, who will tell you a little bit more about the methodology, because he's the one whose brainchild this is. And then we also have Veronica Angel, who will be able to speak more about democratic resilience and or backsliding in the region, because this is what she specializes in. István Hegedűs is our partner from Hungary, and it's been a very important help, because we could only make sure that this instrument has universal applicability by making sure that the questions get adequate responses and are adequate to the context of all the countries that we want to apply it to. And then Denis Chanusha, who is not part of the original team of the project, but he studies democratic resilience and resilience in general in the Eastern Partnership countries, and we wanted someone to provide external feedback on this instrument in Moldova. So Dani, please, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, and first of all, thank you very much for coming here. It's actually quite exciting to be in a room with people after such a long time, especially talking about something different than COVID. Thank you very, very much for coming. I'm in the slightly difficult position of standing here between the presentation of the results and the moment when you start to ask questions. So I'll try to be very brief with this. I'm going to talk about the drier parts of this research, how exactly we thought of coagulating everything, and I'll try to preempt some of your questions, but obviously I'm here, and if you have any more methodological questions, how we thought of what things in what direction and things like that, please, please, please ask them. I would very much like to talk more about that, because it's a process that I hope will be refining itself in time. So let me start delving deeper into something that Juana already said. Democratic resilience, what we're studying here, is different from the quality of institutions. There are countries that have very highly functioning institutions and may not be extremely resilient, whilst there are countries that do not necessarily have highly functional institutions, but are quite resilient. And you can think of examples. One of the more picturesque examples, perhaps, is something that happened a couple of months ago in Romania. A hospital, the operational side of a hospital's functioning was hacked, basically. It was taken over by hackers, and it was held against a ransom. They were asked to pay something like €100,000. But the hospital was extremely resilient because they were doing everything, all of their operations, on paper. So what would normally count as quality of institutions, quality of processes, low, the fact that they were doing all of their operations on paper actually helped them be extremely resilient when faced with a threat. And perhaps less picturesque examples are examples given by the literature of political science that basically says you have countries where you have multiple points across the decision-making process where somebody can intervene and become a veto player, a veto point, if you want. Normally, when assessing institutional quality, multiple veto points are considered to be a weakness because it makes decisions be taken much, much more difficultly. But once you have a decision that goes towards breaking the democratic equilibria, having multiple stages in this decision-making process where that process can be stopped is actually something that gives resilience. Then we can, now that we maybe have this thing a bit clearer, we can talk about how exactly we started thinking about building this index. Basically, I'm an academic myself. Most of my colleagues are academics. we use academia, we use academic knowledge and scientific research, but we're also very keenly aware of the fact that scientific research in general is more, especially in the last couple of years, maybe last decade, is more geared towards understanding the why and the how than in understanding the what. An index is very much about the what. So what we're doing here is basically aggregating findings that political science research, sociology research, economics research have been making about the drivers of democratic resilience, of backsliding and things like that, and aggregating them together in an index that basically evaluates them and helps us create a broad picture of where exactly a country is in terms of its resilience. So in order to take advantage of this scientific knowledge and use it to this purpose that we have here and what we were talking about earlier with our funders, to actually improve the level of governance, we have to do three things. We have to aggregate everything together and make our findings, this index, comparable, make it comprehensive so that it covers everything that influences democratic resilience, and make it quick, make the turnaround and the data collection as fast as possible. And that's basically what we're doing here. Now, the dimension of this matrix that we're building here is a 4x4, just like Juana said. We have the vertical dimensions that are very open and shut. They're very clear cut what exactly they refer to, and then we have the more important horizontal dimensions that each kind of align to a strand of literature or literature findings that we have aggregated within these dimensions. So basically, each of these dimensions pulls together research that has been done on that particular factor in constructing democratic resilience. So for example, we have these institutional structural factors that come very much from the tradition of Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail, but also Douglas North way before that. Basically this idea that institutions very much matter in how a country responds to threats of all kinds. So basically, examples of this would be if major institutions have oversight, if there is some way to control their decisions, if issues that the country is faced with have some sort of institutional responsibility towards resolving them. Agency and elite agency, this is another strand of literature that's a bit more recent. It's basically the answer to the age-long questions, if you want. Would this country or would this situation have happened if this country would have had a different leader? Would Germany have started World War II had it not been for Hitler? Would things like that have happened? And this strand of literature gives a lot of strength to what exactly it is that elites within institutions, within parties that become leaders of countries do in order to preserve their power, maybe even enhance it. And with that purpose in mind, basically deconstruct democracy, ruin it, or whatever, what may come. Crisis triggers, this is another strand of literature that comes mostly from economics, that basically says that institutional equilibria, or equilibria in general, of a democracy tend to be extremely put under pressure by external events that may cause them to function in hyperdrive. So the refugee crisis is one classic example of this type of crisis trigger. Some external factor that comes in, muddies the waters, makes everything extremely tentative, untenable perhaps, and in that space that is created, various political entrepreneurs can take advantage of the situation and enhance their power or destroy the existing equilibrium. Buffers, the last dimension that we're talking about here, basically refers to various types of idiosyncrasies or particularities of a country, of a society, that interact one way or another with the functioning of institutions and especially of elites, preventing them to destroy or to basically move this democratic equilibria that we were talking about. The example that I gave about the hospital is perhaps a good example, an illustrative example for this, but other such examples are foreign diasporas that countries have. If a country has a foreign diaspora in a Western society, that foreign diaspora, to the extent that it's dedicated to assisting their home country into democratizing, will influence through money or social capital that democratic equilibria.
And we found that to be very much the case in Moldova.
Exactly, and even in Romania. Now, to end, basically, the question that maybe is on everybody's minds but was not asked until now is how do we collect this data? And how do we make sure that the way that we collect this data is reliable? So we do the best that we can, which is use the same data collection process that has been used in all of the similar indices in use in the world. We have talked about them, varieties of democracy, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and many, many others. They all rely on expert surveys. We choose our experts in a very, very similar way to what these high-level endeavors have laid out. And we also try to make sure that for stability, for the stability of our estimations in the future, as we continue to evaluate the dynamic of democratic resilience within country, we keep in mind the fact that we need to use more or less the same experts so as to be sure that what we record is indeed changes in the level of democratic resilience or not. This has been, I think, the gist of the methodology. Obviously, there are many, many questions that you might have. I'll be here to answer them, but I just don't want to bore you with too many of these dry details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dani. And I think with that we can move to perhaps the part that's even more interesting than the presentation of our index, which is the qualitative discussion around it, which we hope it will help spur. And Veronica, before we zoom in on the other two countries except Romania, meaning Hungary and Moldova, you study democratic resilience in Central and Eastern Europe in general. Veronica is associate professor at Johns Hopkins in Bologna. Adjunct professor. I'm sorry, I get this wrong all the time, but that's what we wish you in the future. So, any input on what you think, what the quantitative information might have provided in terms of insight into the analysis of what's happening around us?
So first of all, I want to thank the German Marshall Fund for having us here. It's great to see signs of life in the transatlantic relation. So big thanks to Alina and I and our hosts here. And what Oana Popescu and her team, led also by Dani Sandu, have put together is actually it's actually pretty great because this democratic resilience index, the potential that the democratic resilience index and the wider conversation about resilience around it can act as a major corrector for all the many ways in which academia has failed. Academics and researchers have failed the public and decision makers in many ways when it comes to understanding democracy. There are three important ways that I want to zoom on. One of them is the fact that for many decades we have focused so much on adding qualifiers to democracy that we can no longer make sense of what democracy really is. So I grew up in a world in which you would have something like electoral democracy to refer to Russia, and nowadays we see the elections in Russia going on, and they are furthest away from democracy. The results and the process of these elections are furthest away from democracy that we can possibly imagine. All the way to the fact that we have added illiberal to democracy, which is not a product of academics, but we have managed to include it in our scientific research somehow, to be a part of this general understanding that democracy can cover a whole bunch of sins, and it's still that. So we've created a lot of categories that have actually managed to muddle the truth. And if academics and practitioners and policymakers think that they are independent, and citizens as well, and that they live in bubbles, that is also far from the truth, because we influence each other so much that it's very difficult to really even remember at times who started the conversation on what illiberalism is. And nevertheless, now we live in this atmosphere that it is a thing that actually can exist, illiberal democracy, and it is in all the scientific journals treated as such. This is one of the things that the conversation about resilience, democratic resilience, can help correct. This leads me to the second point that we've been talking about. The fact that in the mainstream of political science, we are discussing right now about this concept of democratic backsliding. This is again something that is completely muddled. So when the situation got a bit difficult to understand, oh, wait, what's happening with these countries in Central and Eastern Europe, we again simplified our view of the world, and from making categories, we thought maybe there is some sort of continuum, and it was supposed to go in this way, and now it's going in that way. We fixed it. That's also not how things work, because democratic backsliding, if it were to happen, it's probably happening on some dimensions, while on other dimensions, it's going quite well. And this is, again, not an index, from what I've seen it, on democratic backsliding, or we don't know if it is one yet, because it's a snapshot of what we have at this point, and you've made that point quite clear. But the conversation around it is about this idea of democratic backsliding, which again simplifies the things to a level of the conversation that allows us to get in certain journals, and we're not going to get into that. But that is the conversation that is going on. And the third point is the fact that we anticipate that there is some sort of end state to democracy. That is the thing, it's a package, and from that point on, you either go into some sort of linear direction or not, but you've achieved it. You've entered the club. And this is part of this wishful thinking that existed after 1989, but that still somehow informs the way in which we look at things. And this leaves us blindsided because, again, moving something that worked there, which is Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, may work, but it might work in a very long period of time, and it might not lead to the same results. So we need to know exactly where those institutions worked, why they're very good. We need to know exactly why the people have certain preference for one part of democracy and not for other. So they would like liberalism in terms of economics, but they're not really liberal in terms of values. So they don't necessarily align, or they're not congruent to a certain extent with the countries that they want to be a part of, with whom they want to be a part of the same club. So it's very important to go deeper into what democracy is rather than wider. That's the general thing that I think we've really done a disservice in us as academics to discuss this. And at Johns Hopkins, where I teach something that's called RISK, which is the new buzzword for early warning signs. So this can become an important tool in our methodology as well as to show what can be done in a very systematic way to understand where the world is right now, but not in order to understand how we got here, just to understand where we're going. So there's this element of prediction that is absolutely important when we teach risk and what are the potential risks. And for us to know where we're going, we need to have a very clear snapshot of where we are right now, which sounds like it's super simple, but it's not, because we all have a tendency to look somewhere in the back and just keep wondering how we got here. And that's great, that's what makes us experts. But what we need to know and what policymakers need to know is where do we go from here? And that is our contribution to telling the future, if you like, or at least that's the product that I think we're selling here between the lines. So thanks a lot for inviting me and making me a part of this.
Thank you very much, Veronica. And I will just contradict you a little bit. The buzzword now is foresight. Ever since we have a commissioner dealing with that and the report and so on, foresight is what everybody does. So there's going to be a lot of competition around. But in terms of thinking about the future, István, I think, your contribution might be one of the most interesting in the whole economy of this index, because Hungary is what everybody looks at. And it's both a good thing and a bad thing, because I think there's a lot of oversimplification around using Hungary and Poland as the examples of democratic backsliding, lumping them together, thinking that if we look at these two countries, we're going to understand what happens to all the others. And we actually have found that there are very marked differences between countries, and there are also very nuanced facets of democratic resilience in Hungary and of backsliding. So could you perhaps offer a few insights into the specific case of Hungary in this respect?
Yeah, I will try to do my best, and thanks for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here and part of this project.
And thank you to the Hungarian Europe Society for partnering with us on that.
Sure, thanks. Just to start with, when you ask especially about Hungary, it reminds me that, let's say, 30-some years ago, when regime change happened all over in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm old enough to remember, and I was part of it back then, and German Marshall Fund also was present actually, and supporting us in this democratic transition so many years ago. I felt myself in a box talking almost only about Hungary, and I always wished to speak about our joint European project. And some 10-15 years later, I was part of discussions like the future of Europe or whatever important issues we all had. And now I am back into that box in the last 10 years again, only speaking about Hungary. But that's history, and maybe, as you mentioned, it's not a linear progress, but something ups and downs, and I'm again a Hungarian expert. That's our history. So to be more serious, I would start with the problem what Veronica started with, this expression illiberal democracy, which was partly fabricated by Viktor Orban, as I think you also referred to him, although Farid Zakaria used this expression in scientific terms before him. But Orban talked about illiberal democracy in a positive sense, and that was very new. Well, since then there is a debate whether this expression exists or not, or is it simply a falsification. And I tend to agree with those who say that democracy should be liberal in modern times, and there is nothing like illiberal democracy, at least in our current age. I don't speak about the Greek democracy, that's another story, and I'm not an expert on it. But maybe some others have also some reason to argue that liberalism and democracy might not go hand in always. So maybe we should not speak again about a simple dilemma, whether illiberal democracy or democracy without liberalism, but we might think that there might be some populist illiberal parties and regimes which are still more or less democratic, but then this authoritarian tendency goes far enough, then democracy can also die when it becomes too illiberal. But that's an issue what we might discuss later on. But I think it's important to talk about these not really theoretical problems, but living in Hungary, sometimes very pragmatic issues. Where is the turning point when democracy ends? And we haven't realized that now we live in something still in between, in a hybrid regime. It's not only about hybrid conferences, it's also about hybrid regimes where authoritarian tendencies have become more salient and much more everyday practice than before. And then maybe it's too late. And it comes to some practical issues that I would like to raise very shortly because I know that we don't have much time. First of all, when we participated in this project and we tried to approach and request experts in Hungary to answer to the questions of the survey, we faced a problem what many of you know, that it's very hard to reach out to so-called experts, maybe real experts, who feel that they belong to the other side, who are close to the government or are simply advisors or experts representing the way of thinking of the government. For them, an independent NGO is suspicious as such. When we ask them to participate in such a survey, they hesitate, or maybe they feel that they are not allowed, they are banned maybe from the top of their party or political community to support a research which is represented by a Hungarian NGO, but which is financed by some foreign suspicious, maybe hostile institutions, even German Marshall Fund today, not to speak about Freedom House or other such institutions, or anybody or any institution which might have any links to George Soros, who is certainly the #1 enemy today in Hungary. So it's not easy to have a balanced picture from Hungary, because I'm sure that many of those whom we try to reach had not answered actually, because we do not belong to their camp. And that's enough reason not answering to us at all. So in that sense, I have to admit that maybe the outcome of this project is a little bit biased, has a liberal, conservative, democratic bias, because those who belong to the illiberal camp might not have participated, or only in a smaller number. I do not want to say that all experts are liberal or democratic conservatives, but it has some sense as well that actually the current regime has much less real experts than those who belong to this school of thinking where analysis is more important than propaganda. Unfortunately, that might change because the government makes a lot of efforts to change this picture. How they dealt with the CEU, which had to leave Hungary, or how they try to reformulate academic life or universities as such in Hungary, has a clear objective to shape the future of intellectuals and professionals in Hungary and to change this proportion in favoring illiberal ways of thinking. So maybe in 10 years, for a moment I'm pessimistic, we will have many more illiberal experts than today. My second point is that while you all mentioned that this is an early warning mechanism, what we would like to show you today and maybe later on again and again. Now, in the case of Hungary, as you all know, it's not early enough. Actually, it's too late. All sort of analysis, there is a consent in the scientific literature amongst observers in the international media that Hungary, as Jana mentioned as well, actually does not belong to the full-fledged democracies anymore. I don't want to go into details because everybody knows. I don't have to speak about politics, media, civil society. Also, a very strange foreign policy led by Viktor Orban, when Russia or China seem to be more close to Hungary than our original allies within the European Union. When you look at the rhetoric of the regime, Brussels attacked us just recently again, whilst Russia and China are our close friends and partners in all regards of politics and now more and more policy areas, economy, financing, and so on. So I don't want to get into details because you know the story, more or less. I'm ready to answer any questions, but it's too late. So today I do not have to convince anybody in Brussels that there is a problem with the Orban regime. A couple of years ago, a center right-wing politician from the European People's Party might have argued with me that it's not true, I am a little bit pessimistic or I go too far. Now we don't have any such views, I think, in the democratic camp in Europe anymore, which is brilliant as for analysis, but it shows that how slow was the reaction of the EU institutions. I don't want to blame any institutions, any politicians in particular, but in general, the reaction of the EU was certainly not sufficient. And my third point is just the opposite of the previous ones. I want to be more optimistic at the end. As you know, we will face elections next year in April 2022. And what I would like to emphasize, there is a chance, actually, a real chance for a change of government, what the current opposition even calls a change of regime. And today, according to the polls, it's about 50-50% who might win. First time we have a sort of united opposition. We are just in the period of primaries. So these are the voters, the citizens, who might choose who would be the prime minister candidate of the opposition against Viktor Orban. This is a colorful united opposition, I think many of you know, even including Jobbik, the former extreme right-wing party, which moved quite a lot towards the center and became part of this colorful, strange coalition, which actually shows quite a united picture recently, and that's what voters wanted. So politicians have to realize that, and even party leaders have to realize, that there was a pressure on them that most of the people who would like to get rid of the Orban regime and Viktor Orban himself would vote for a united opposition, and they don't care which party they belong to, but they want to see a real chance, which means, because of the electoral system, which was refabricated by Viktor Orban and his party and government, it's a must in the individual constituencies where we only have one round to have one joint candidate of the opposition to run against one Fidesz candidate. Otherwise, that's simple mathematics, the opposition would lose and the regime will survive. So there is a chance, and if there is a sort of real little luck, and the opposition can show credibility and a sort of elan and belief in itself and so on, then political development might bring a surprise. And what I would like to emphasize as a last sentence, this is, as you all know, it's not a Hungarian issue. Viktor Orban became a sort of hero of the radical right, of the extreme right, in Europe and beyond Europe. So a defeat of Orbanism in Hungary would send a signal to many other countries and to many other citizens all over in Europe and beyond that it's possible to, even in a half democracy, in a not full-fledged illiberal system, in a hybrid regime, to win elections against a populist illiberal leader. We don't know yet, but there is a real hope now.
Thank you very much, István. I think the importance of contagion can certainly not be overestimated, and we have incorporated it as one of the dimensions in our analysis, not just in terms of regional contagion, because sometimes countries have very strong partnerships outside of their immediate region, and what happens to the respective actors, say the US under Trump, for instance, has a very important bearing on the conduct of other countries. I think the first thing we need to hope for in the case of Hungary is that elections are going to be free and fair, because this is actually one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we have found with respect to the attempt by the Budapest regime to control as much as possible the outcome of elections and of political competition. And now I think, essentially it hasn't necessarily been surprising for us in the process of doing this. But when you see it, when you visualize it in front of your eyes, it's actually more striking than when you think of it. We found Hungary and Moldova to be very similar in many ways. I think it is that says a lot both about the EU enlargement process and at least part of the hypocrisy that is that has become an intrinsic part of it, and about the EU's capacity to continue to influence its own members. The worrying part is that Hungary is going down, whereas Moldova is currently going up. And it must be said that the analysis has been carried out before the current president, Maia Sandu, and her party had the parliamentary majority that they have now. And I will anticipate a little bit one of the questions that we have received already online when I ask you, Denis, to refer perhaps not just to the resilience of the Eastern Partnership states and Moldova in particular that you know well about, but somebody is asking us also about the specific factors that suggest how people and society can effectively push back against the backsliding, and they quote the example of the Moldovan elections in November 2020 and July 2021 to show that this is a process whereby the people have seemingly provided the government with a new kind of liberal mandate against the background that was relatively discouraging in Moldova as well. So if you have any insight into this, that would also provide a question to our viewers online.
Yes, of course. The entire conversation is very interesting. You raised a lot of questions and issues, and I would like to really discuss all of them, but I will try to focus on the most important, including the question that was asked by the viewer. I believe that we really should admit the fact that not only democracies can be resilient, but also the autocracies and illiberal regimes. And exactly the case of Hungary and Belarus nearby, Russia, is actually, they show that we probably will have to start to analyze the resilience of the autocratic regimes quite soon, just because they are becoming too impactful on the region. And Russia is again the example which shows that an electoral democracy can become just an electoral autocracy. Because there is nothing democratic in the way they conducted the elections. And at the same time, learning from the experience of those actors that are forced to operate in this kind of autocratic regimes, we can learn tools and we can explore ways to to help the democracies which are at the brink to become illiberal regimes. And I think that what I have heard about the Hungarian elections, it sounds to me very much like smart voting in Russia, which was, of course, blocked by the regime in many ways. And I hope that Hungary can make use of those, let's say, inventions of the Russian opposition in order to put them for a good mission and reason in Hungary. So exactly my point is going in the direction that what we try to develop and to assess for democracy can be applied and can be reused by the liberal regime, but also the other way around. So we can look what are going through the democratic elements and groups of those societies that live in illiberal regimes, and actually try to really extract those solutions for us in case we deal with similar issues. I think that this could be a really important conclusions from our today's conversation. But if to go concretely to the index that I find very useful, I was really enjoying to answer the questions, because I even asked for an additional field to answer the questions. They are very much in line with my PhD work and research, and I was trying to understand what were the minds thinking behind asking those questions, and now I understand better what was actually the purpose of some of the questions. But I think that it's also important to underline the definition of the democratic resilience. Because if you look at the resilience as such, then this is the ability to bounce back or forward from a situation of internal crisis or shock or external danger. And this kind of definition probably would help us to narrow down even more the focus of our research, because otherwise we are really very comprehensive, which is good because we are covering a lot of fragilities, vulnerabilities, as you mentioned during the presentation. But if we have a working definition, then it would make the product even more solid, and it will also help the reader to understand what exactly we understand through democratic resilience. This could be something which can be an added value to what you have produced already. And then the definition could also help to have these focal points in actually looking how exactly the institutions work or react, because we always talk about reaction to something, not just their existence in a certain environment, but how they react to dependent or independent even variables. It can be also the case that an independent variable is just too strong, and it can influence the system as such, some institutions, some agencies, state agencies. And then we are dealing with adaptation, transformation, and absorption. These are three elements that probably also could be somehow integrated. They are already in the index. I can see them now, but maybe it's important also to make them more visible so that we can understand, okay, here a certain institution showed real capacities of absorption, or no, they are now transforming due to electoral voting, for instance, or due to coalition of NGOs or civil society organizations in general, the way the agents and the sense of agency is really playing out in certain environments, be it governmental or non-governmental. And then it's also important then to go to more specific areas where you can exactly find those drivers that you very nicely described, and I fully support the idea of having this buffers and drivers, but then we need to also define what is one, because to me they might be as synonyms, but also they can be complementary to each other. So probably in Moldovan case, obviously the drivers are very important, as you have mentioned already in the question that you have formulated. I think that now I could slowly move to the Moldovan case study and to exactly pinpoint the aspects that are related to buffers and crisis triggers. Crisis triggers is another important element that should be probably in a way conceptualized with more precision, because in my view, and you have mentioned this in the report, we talk about critical junctures, and then the critical junctures are creating those moments of change. They are shaking the equilibrium. They are changing the direction of movement of certain actors or the state as such. And Moldova is exactly that case study where the critical juncture, in my view, are the elections and how they are changing now radically the movement of some institutions, of some parts of the society, because diaspora is part of the society, though it is not within the society, is beyond the national borders. And then just going through the areas that you have used in order to categorize these elements of buffers and critical triggers, I think that in politics it's obvious the importance of diaspora. It was already mentioned, and I need to emphasize that the voting rate among the diaspora has increased about 7 times since 2009, and therefore, if to make, according to some estimates, about 15% of the votes that have been received by the party of Maya Sandu, the Solidarity and Action Party, they were offered by the diaspora. So probably if diaspora is incentivized even more, it could be even bigger share of contribution of the diaspora, which is primarily located in the West to the process of democratization of the country. And I think that Moldova could be used as a good example for probably other countries that face similar exercise of emigration. Romania is one of, I think, the closest country that can be used as a model, but also Moldovans have learned a lot from the way Romanians emigrated. So the Romanian passport that are quite popular among Moldovans, and we speak about more than 600,000 Moldovans having out of 2.6 million population who have the Romanian passports. We can also include those who emigrated, but it's very hard to distinguish exactly which is the amount of passports that are held by the Moldovans who stay in the country and those who emigrated. But still, Ukraine is another country where also the voting rights of the diaspora is accepted, because we have Armenia in the region where you have a huge diaspora, but they don't have the right to vote. So the diaspora is relevant only for the social capital and for the economic capital for that particular country. In Moldova, the diaspora participates both as a political actor and as a social and economic agent, because it brings money, it brings know-how, it also can trigger some processes within the society through different ways, influencing their families and many other ways. And then the important factor that is actually keeping the country captive in a way is the weakness of the state institutions, and this weakness is very much linked to the corruption that exists in the state, in the society. We speak both about high-level corruption and systemic corruption, and this is something which is on the agenda of the current government, and it was very much one of the drivers of the elections, the anti-corruption agenda. And I think that this is very common for all countries in the region. Romania, not so long time ago, was also focused very much on that. Ukraine, Russia, obviously, Navalny and all his campaign was around the high-level corruption. So to help the country to become more resilient, Moldova will have to really fix the issue of strengthening the institutions and making them immune to both political and systemic corruption. Because also we have citizens who would like to solve their issues faster, and then they are actually somehow participating and they're facilitating the process of corruption. So it's not only about political corruption, and we should be really very sincere with our own scenes and the way we want to really look at this very complex phenomenon of corruption. And then the economic aspects are very much linked to the buffers that lie on remittances, as I have mentioned, but also the external assistance, which for Moldova is very important, because the country's budget, every time when it comes to a new law on budget, we need to revise the previous law, and to look whether we can attract more investments, direct investments, which is much more difficult, or just assistance, loans from international organizations that you have referred to in the study, like European Union or the International Monetary Fund. And this is something which helps the economy to actually be on float. So,
I think that is, if I can ask you to try and wrap up, because we already are getting questions.
Then I will just focus on the question that was asked by the viewer, and I will again mention the fact that the elections were helped by the diaspora and by the way the anti-corruption campaign played out, but also the importance of the external pressure on the local elites and elite agency and agents. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the government right now is facing different challenges, and one of the biggest challenges is to try to reform weak institutions while getting rid of corrupt elements and looking for prepared public servants which are in deficit. And this is something that they always underline as one of the main challenges. And I believe that resilience, very much of a state or of a democracy, is a product of the resilience of the society, the resilience of the individuals. And then one of the focus probably of the index, but also of those who would like to support the index, is to really focus on the human capital. The social capital, the human capital, how we invest in education. And I think that probably education and the social policy could have even more presence in the index and in our talks about the index, because they are actually the initial triggers of other changes that take place within the states and in a democracy at a large scale. And here I will stop.
Thank you, Dennis. And actually, the question was asking beyond what I mentioned, specifically this, which is that the observation that leaders tend to be less liberal than their people does seem valid in most countries experiencing democratic backsliding. Are there any specific factors that appeared in the research that suggest how people and society can effectively push back against the backsliding? So Veronica, Dani, Istvan, if you would like to add anything from the Romanian experience, perhaps, where we were for a while on the brink of following in the footsteps of Poland and Hungary, then we came back from the brink. Any insights?
I think I can venture a bit of an answer. It's a bit tentative, but I'll formulate it nonetheless. I think one of the things that the person asking the question referred to, which is very interesting, is that leaders tend to be, leaders of countries that are going through democratic backsliding tend to be less liberal than the population. I'm not sure that's true. I think leaders tend to be more liberal than the elites, than the middle class, than the people that we're representative of, that our viewer is probably representative of. But most of these places that we're looking at, especially the places, the countries that are studied here, are countries that are going through extreme social and economic polarization, that have a huge chunk of their population stuck very much behind from an economic perspective, from an axiological perspective, from a social perspective. These people, because they are left behind, they can constitute a very blunt and very powerful political instrument when wielded by one of those leaders that we're talking about. So this in political science is called affective polarization. Basically, to just simplify it, it basically says that from a certain point onward, people who are extremely upset with their situation will vote just to change the status quo. And if the status quo has been or had been liberal, voting against that basically means that they would be open to vote for any sort of illiberal counter position or counter candidate. And this is one of the risks that we're running into. These countries are countries that have grown from an economic perspective in a fantastic pace, but that growth has not been distributed in a way that can keep a sort of an economic and social equilibrium within society that doesn't devolve into this effective polarization and then thus the empowerment of potentially illiberal autocratic leaders.
Wanted to add something, I think, and then we'll turn to the room as well, not just for questions but also comments if you have any, and Andrei, Costin, Clara also if you want to add anything.
I'll just make a brief comment. This question is so good because it shows exactly why the concept of backsliding is useless. On some dimensions, such as the values of the population, we see significant trends towards more congruence with Western European values in the East. So you can see that after 1989, in those indexes that we have that have looked at this, you can see that there is a trend towards more acceptance towards minorities, sexual minorities, multiculturalism, different religions, and so on. The more you go to the East, the less congruence you find with these kinds of liberal values. But there is a trend that the society is somehow becoming more liberal. And strangely enough, I mean, not strangely enough, but in Hungary, it is much better than in Romania on this particular dimension. So you have more support for LGBTQ plus community in Hungary than you have in Romania. And then you have the other dimension, which is the elite dimension, in which things are reveal themselves as looking differently. And the idea that Viktor Orban was liberal in the 90s and then transformed into an illiberal leader, I think is a bit overstated. Viktor Orban was no liberal in the 90s, and his best partners left him sometimes around 1993, 95. So these were warning signs way back into the 90s that no one captured because we were looking at democracy as a whole, and it was supposed to go in one direction instead of looking at elements. And now, because we have all these instruments and methodologies, and we can break it in more clearly, we can see that certain things are going well, certain things are not going well. And that's why this question is so important, because most change will be driven from grassroots levels, and also because of international contagion, as Juana likes to call it.
Thank you very much. You all have microphones in your seats, so it's okay. You can just speak and you will be heard. You don't need to do anything. Andrei, I saw your hand first, not just because you're part of the team. I will definitely turn to the others.
So I have an answer to that question about what can be done. It's not from the data of the study, but it's certainly coherent with the data of the study. And my suggestion is to, among others, resist the political polarization. I remember when we had problems in Romania, when the Social Democrats, probably most people here know, when they were trying to influence the justice through emergency decrees. In the aftermath of that time, at some point, we made some focus groups, and some of these were Social Democratic voters, and some of those were not Social Democratic voters. And the opinion about the Social Democratic Party at that point in its history was identical. Social Democrat people, voters, were still voting with the Social Democrats because of various reasons, including history, including other subjects. But if you would see on blind the new transcript, you don't know who is the radical anti-socialist and who is the socialist there. And at that point, the voters of the Social Democratic Party did not vote coherent to party lines, and they stood back and let their party fall quite willingly and quite knowingly. And I think that has a lot with the improvement of the situation of Romania at that point. And on a different note, perhaps a comment about the diaspora. I would say that it's not self-evident that Western diaspora is pro-democratic. Diaspora are people who are unhappy because that's why they left. We're talking recent diaspora, and they are risk tolerant because again that's why they left. And my perspective is that in Romania at least, they would vote more or less anti-establishment.
Andrei, can I just stop you for a second because I'm getting instructions from the organizers that you need to lift the arm of the chair and push a talk button because you cannot be heard online. Oh, there, look in front. So this is on the left-hand side.
Capacul mânerului. Ridică mânerul scaunului. Din față, din față. Open it upstairs.
I'm so sorry. Okay.
And push the button.
Push the button?
Okay.
Okay, the button is pushed.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to repeat maybe. Just moving to the comment.
If you can sum it up.
Yeah. So my first comment, which was not heard, was that resisting political polarization can be an important factor in improving the democratic climate and resisting democratic shifts, anti-democratic shifts. And the comment which I was just starting to do was that diaspora, at least in Romania and possibly also in Moldavia, are risk tolerant because they left their country and are unhappy with the status quo. And they are voting against the status quo. And in Romania, the status quo was the Social Democratic Party, but they also voted out of 3 far-right/populist parties, 2 of them got good support in the diaspora. I'm talking about the Dan Diaconescu party and currently the Our party. And they voted, I believe that some of them, perhaps, it's a theory, it's a hypothesis, some of them voted for Maia Sandu because it was the new thing, it was a change, as Dan suggested, not because they entirely identify with all that she believes in. And in 4 years' time, when Maia Sandu is perhaps the face of the system, there might be surprises.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question or a comment here in front as well.
Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guys in the House of European History. First, congratulations to German Marshall Fund that you have the courage to make a live event. Then you encouraged me to a question in mentioning the elections in Russia. I find it's a big pity that there was no delegation from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And now my question for the upcoming elections in Hungary. Do we know already whether there will be a delegation from this organization?
Istvan?
I don't know, but I think that there is always a monitoring delegation going to Hungary, but without a real authorization of, making some comments. Actually, it was the OSCE which declared last time that the elections were free but not fair. So we have such an opinion from very high-level international institution, but that's all, not other special, reporting or observations on the spot. So I think there are different levels of such delegation, what they are allowed to do, and Hungary is still belonging to the EU, was taken as a free and fair country. So the investigation did not go far enough.
I just wanted to underline, I think that I'm pretty much sure about those who voted for Maia Sandu, they're also citizens of Romania. So they have dual citizenship. Because the majority of those who feel comfortable and risk takers, they have the most guaranteed security, which is the Romanian citizenship passport. Not the others, and therefore there is also an additional layer of geopolitical inspiration when they vote in Moldova. And if you take very closely the analysis of the ways they mobilized, the way they mobilized in 2016, because back then started everything, the diaspora started to be a thing. because they have helped each other to go to the voting stations. And then in 2020, they repeated this exercise. And in 2021, they just, in a way, they were prepared to have the last say in these important elections.
I just want to mention something on behalf, not on behalf of the OSCE, but the reason why they were not there is not because they didn't want to be, but because their participation was limited by Russia not sharing information on where to put the observers, how many there should be. So in a way, they could not really do their work, which is it's.
I will turn back to the questions online, but for now, I think I saw some hands going up over there as well, and maybe we can take 3 questions together and then try to answer them, because we don't have a lot of time. So please, if you can introduce yourself and
Sure, my name is Miguel.
Make sure to speak in the microphone when you lift the left arm of your chair and push the talk button.
I'm pressing the button. Hopefully this...
And you have to lift the microphone as well.
At the end, all right. My name is Miguel Diaz. I'm retired formerly with the State Department. I guess my comments have to do with the resiliency of this exercise to the criticism that undoubtedly will come its way. And I could think of 2 things that kind of stick out as problematic. One is the ambitiousness of the exercise. I saw the matrix, and it's a lot of material that you're covering there. The other, and probably more worrisome one to me, is this reliance on the experts to provide you the feedback. I think one of the commentators, professor at my old graduate school at Bologna, said that the expert community really hasn't shown its brightness over the last few years. They tend to be self-referential. They talk to each other, and I see you talking mostly to yourself. And the fact of the matter is that the experts, for the most part, have been wrong on a lot of this. Not too long ago, we had experts claiming that Afghanistani democracy was stronger than it is, and we know what happened there. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is that you have a real audience of people with political agendas, with money's agendas, and so my preoccupation is, how do you translate your exercise, which is an academic exercise from what I see, into something that will have an impact on a political community, on a community that doesn't necessarily talk the talk of the academics?
Can we try to take a few more questions and then answer them all together?
Okay, Garvin Walsh, and it seems to be Johns Hopkins Day here today, so I'm going to shamelessly plug some research I did for the Arena Center at Johns Hopkins on Hungary. And we found that, beneath very surface political polarization, there's actually quite a lot of unity. And what's interesting about about the cultural values and the sense of society, what's interesting about this kind of these kinds of attacks on democracies, how they convert 1 or 2 things into identity markers and then use that to polarize society. It doesn't necessarily mean that society is deeply, fundamentally polarized beneath, and it's possible to overcome that polarization by, reaching out a bit beyond your bubbles. The other thing we found out there, by the way, was the media bubble in Hungary is much more intermixed. There's a lot of people who watch both independent and pro-government media, and it's interacted. Is there a way that that kind of stuff can be measured more broadly so that we go beyond experts and start looking at audience shares, start looking at the ability of certain channels to succeed? Look again in Hungary, where an example of resilience would be Index got taken over by one of Orban's crony, and then Telex got set up, and the audience is moving and has significantly moved to that already. Can we look at those kind of phenomena in other countries and see whether similar resilience exists elsewhere?
Thank you. One more over there.
Hi there. Brady Hills with the International Republic Institute. And thank you again for the presentation. And this will be, I guess, my second time commenting on the research, which I think is fantastic. But one question I do have is mainly to you, Danny, I guess, about methodology. And in particular about, well, also talking about the sampling bias issues that Isfan mentioned. What kind of weighting was done to perhaps counteract that? And, is there any, well, I understand it's a pilot project, but, was there any talk about taking another country as some sort of baseline, something that in Europe, at least, most people would think of at the top of their head, high on this would be somewhere like Germany, which would have some, shared authoritarian past and things like that, could make a good, initial baseline, for example, for now, which hopefully you could then expand on the future with some sort of, European average or something. But just looking at that, and then also on the same topic, taking the other pre-existing indexes out there, like VDEM, to, was that used to check your findings against comparable indicators that they had? And how did that look?
Thank you. Let's take one more because the gentleman has been waiting patiently for quite a while now. So
thank you very much. I sit here with a British passport, a Polish father. I live in Switzerland. I was a candidate for the European Parliament, failed as a anti-Brexit person. I also have a teaching role. My MBA students in Switzerland some 10 years ago, and I asked them, what do you have in Switzerland that we don't have in the UK? I said, don't tell me mountains and cows and cheese. They told me democracy. I giggled because you guys don't own your property. You don't control the heat. Then I looked at one of your slides where you showed some of the problem areas. And I feel very much from my country of birth that we're going through exactly that same process. It's very dramatic what's happening. So my plea to you is please include the United Kingdom in your analysis. Thank you.
unfortunately, we have strong incentives to do so. So let me turn to you if you want to answer the questions that have been asked. And I think at least in I can think of the results analysis. Clara, you might also have some input. But before I turn to you, let me just make a language clarification, which I think is necessary in terms of the inevitable bias of respondents. It's called an expert survey because that's the name, the terminology, but we have not applied it to experts only, but rather to stakeholders. So I think stakeholders would have been a much more appropriate name, because when we essentially drew up the lists of potential respondents, the names that were there were people who were, business people. Some of them were educators, others were journalists, others were politicians. So it depends, obviously, on the definition of an expert as well, but it is not to be taken in the sense of, we just ask those who regularly analyze the developments in these countries. That is not to say, and I think Danny can say more about this, that we have eliminated the bias altogether. And clearly, just measuring democratic resilience is a challenge in a country where you already have people who are aware that this is basically the opposite camp doing that.
So lots of very interesting questions. I'll try to put them all together and give some answers, and hopefully that will help. If not, we can talk afterwards, because I think there's a lot of fascinating stuff that we can discuss, and I'd really like your inputs. First, on the experts, like Juana said, it's an expert survey because the procedure is called, from an academic perspective, an expert survey, but the stakeholders are very, very varied. It's an expert survey as opposed to a general representative sample. We select people who are in a position of being decision makers, stakeholders. And therefore, we select people like us, but very few of them, probably about 10% of the sample. And then other people are journalists, mayors, people in civil society, people who work in political parties, so people who hopefully are better attuned to what the world is like than I am or we are. Too many variables. I fully agree. The thing that right. So I think the thing that we need to clarify here, and this might be, it might be helpful to illustrate in a different way. We're not looking at causes. So we have a lot of variables, but we're not necessarily looking at causes. So there are many things that can make an autocratic leader want to take over an institution or want to limit legislation or one way or another. We don't look at the reasons. We look at the actions that basically let us know that that thing is happening or not. So we look at the correlates, which are much more visible, and that's also another reason why it's easier to use experts, because we don't necessarily want a very in-depth, academic, lengthy kind of process by which they get to their answers. We want them to basically tell us what they see from their own experience. There are issues with expert surveys, but there is a reason why they're used, and everybody uses them. And the main reason is, well, actually, if they use them well, they can be defended. By asking basically the same experts, so the same sample, the same question this year and then again next year and then again next year, you're basically seeing the difference in opinion of the same individual. Whereas if you ask the 5 of us what we believe about a topic today, and then next year you ask other 5 people who might be like us, but are not really, you can't really compare the results. So that's one of the things that basically defends, guards from some of the more spurious effects that you were worried about. Your question, super. Actually, a lot of the things that you suggested are things that we have in mind as well. So basically, we wanted to have an additional component to the index that takes into account, one, variables, especially from other indexes, and indicators from other indexes, and pool them all together and somehow make them act like an additional score. So it's a sort of a factor analysis that we had in mind. It's something that we definitely want to continue exploring. We didn't really have the time to do it right now. Plus, it was also stymied a little bit by the fact that not all of these indexes published results these years because of the obvious problems that we've had. So we have to really consider what we treat as a baseline there and things like that. Control case. This actually leads us to a very interesting kind of ontological question. I think the strongest part of the analysis and of any index of this kind is the within case comparison. The between cases comparisons are bound to be somewhat problematic by the fact that democracy and the democratic balance or equilibria, by definition an equilibria, it can be at very different levels. So like the example of the gentleman from Britain was, Switzerland has a type of democratic equilibria that some people looking at it might see it not necessarily democratic, whereas other countries have an equilibrium in a different place. You can't really compare easily different equilibria because they're all over the place. But what you can compare is the deviation from what happened 2 years ago or 4 years ago or 6 years ago.
And if you see that a country that was going in this direction at a certain point takes a large turn to the left or to the right, you can tell that there's a problem there. In terms of direct comparison to other places, it's a little bit more problematic from an ontological standpoint. But we do take our precautionary measures to make those comparisons valid to the extent that we can. Obviously, a long discussion. I'm sorry I took so long, but maybe Costin or somebody else wants to.
If you allow me just a second, I would like to pass on to Clara as well, because I'm sure she has some insights into this too. And just to say also, by way of introduction, that one thing this instrument is not going to be is the ultimate and comprehensive instrument that's going to explain all the factors in democratic resilience. We definitely have in mind adding a qualitative analysis component, because otherwise what you get is obviously a glimpse into the what, but not necessarily the why. And the same dimension in different countries might have different consequences or explanations. And Clara has also been working on an instrument that looks at at resilience at the local level, which I think is again a very welcome complementary instrument. So Clara, if you have anything to add to what's been said already.
Well, if you lifted the ball to the field, of course, you can find the recent policy paper I wrote on the GMF website starting today. But it's not about the local resilience; it's about the National Democratic Resilience Index. And with a caution that you might take offense with me, I think it's not a democratic resilience index. Don't be scared. I think it's much more. I think it's a societal resilience index, because, as Dani just mentioned, at the end of the day, it doesn't provide any causal relationship to the quality of democracy per se, but rather it investigates the strengths and weaknesses within our societies on different multilateral levels. And I think that's a very important point to make about the quality and the added value of this project. And that's also an explanation of why we didn't finalize the causal test with a variety of democracy values as an outcome, as a dependent variable, which probably we will. Now, in terms of my comment and my question, I have a question for Veronica and Istvan, and a comment to Dani. My question to Veronica and Istvan is that this instrument essentially reflects a lot on the ideas. As you all saw, we have a cluster of variables that portray liberal ideas prevalence in these three countries. And we take that to be, let's say, a loaded component. So we consider liberal values to be an element of the quality of democracy in these countries. But if we say they're not prevalent, if we say there is some fault within the quality of liberal ideas in this country, does that in fact affect the alignment, the broader alignment that takes place in the Western world regarding democratic values and liberal values? So I am all for testing our democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, but because this is a GMF or Western Eastern Europe event, we have to ask the question, to what extent is this type of criticism or diagnostic, as you want to put it, hurting the transatlantic alignment or commitment to democratic values? And that's a question maybe to all of you. And a short comment, methodological comment to Dani. I think you're going to have a hell of a challenge to pose the same questions to the same people. And this is, a very sad experience I had doing that in Moldova and Eastern Partnership countries. With the Committee of the Regions, we followed up first with the Committee of the Regions and then with the OECD. We followed up on the similar expert survey with NGOs and academics and et cetera, in Eastern Partnership. And over a 3-year time span, we found that less than half were still active or willing to answer, which I think says a lot about the democratic resilience of our societies in Central and Eastern Europe and Eastern Partnership countries. And finally, take a look at the picture. I think think this is such a great picture because it portrays something that Veronica said over and over in certain conferences. It's the fact that we're bursting the democratic bubble in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's not just that we're bursting the democratic bubble per se, but rather this a very shallow framing of what democracy actually is and what it resides upon in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's your image. Thank you all so much for working together on this project. And these are my comments and questions.
Thank you, and I will take this cue just to mention, because the question has been posed online as to how often we intend to carry out the study, and we were discussing this, and at this point we think every 2 years, so 2 or 3 years would probably be the ideal time frame to detect real movement and not just contextual variations. And we were also asked to how many countries we're going to expand it and how we choose them. And the answer is very simple: as many as possible and as many as will be funded. And as to how we choose them, I think it's going to be, obviously, since our partnership is with DG NEAR, I hope their interest in the European neighborhood is going to remain solid. So the Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership countries are obvious candidates. Central Eastern Europe is the one that is our region of interest, and then clearly we also have very interesting case studies there. But then Western Europe and beyond is another region where we think this is where we tend to underanalyze such a movement, because we take things for granted, and then we're going to be surprised a few years from now. So we would ideally like to extend it there as well. We need to wrap up soon, but Veronica, sorry I cut you off earlier, or if you want to, any of you, Istvan, Denis, Veronica, if you want to address some of the comments or questions that were asked.
Maybe we can have a round of comments and then...
Absolutely, but then let me just throw in 2 questions that were asked online. Maybe you can lump them up with your answer. One was for Dani, and it was about your decision to include communist melancholia in understanding democratic resilience, and how it applies to a country that doesn't have a communist past. What do you do in that case? Is that just for a specific part of the world or not? And then the other question was, why is it important to maintain or achieve democratic societies? And I think that's by way of an ending, a very good question. And it goes on to say, in the previous sequence, the 90s, the motivations were access to resources, freedom to speak, freedom to representation of values, access to a perceived possibility of prosperity, or to have the potential that they have in the West. What are the clear current goals of a respective democratic society? And so if you can offer any answers to these as well, that would be wonderful.
Well, I can start with the last one. I'm glad you also read the second part, because a question, why is it important to have democratic society, is not worth dealing with. So it's good that we had everything else there included, because it's just a way to provoke. And it's exactly the answer was in the question, because those things are not achieved, and you have to achieve them, and they will never be an ideal type that will somehow exist. So you got to struggle towards that. And this connects to the question of the gentleman from SAIS who left, who actually asked a very important question: how will you use this index to affect change? And probably this is something that we could wrap up with. And this is a very important question, because one fancy conference at a time is not going to save democracy. And my answer here is quite modest, I suppose, because one instrument is not enough. We are part of a greater conversation about resilience, and if we're going to end up using this word more often than backsliding or other wishful thinking ideals about the countries of Europe and beyond, and about separating things so in such clear-cut ways in the world, then we've done our 0.03%. Just made that up. So I think, I mean, it's definitely something that we have to do continuously, and then of course it's a matter of funding, the ability to. I mean, you have answers to this, and it's definitely always comes down to money. So I just gonna finish with money.
Yeah, I would like to react to the question about what to do, how to react to all these negative tendencies, backsliding or negative events and processes in Hungary and beyond. And the argument was that maybe journalists who left Index for Telex gave a sort of example, and there are some others, not so many, when actually new institutions were created. That might be something even more than, we might call it even resistance actually, and creating an alternative Hungary from below. That's also an opportunity. And I just wanted to give you another example, which is about how citizens, taxpayers actually use their money in supporting independent civil organizations. In Hungary, you can give 1% of your personal tax to NGOs. And this year, what you know, for example, very well, the story of Klub Radio. Klub Radio received from citizens, last year they received 33 million forints, now it's 45. This time another one from 18 to 21. And the NGO which deals with the rights of gay people received this year, instead of 3, but 9 million forints. But to compare it with the by the NGO which is supported by the government, what is called Gongo, I think that's the government-supported NGO. This is in Hungarian CÖF, the Civil Cooperation Forum. It has only received 1 million forint from all citizens in Hungary. So it's evident that people support those NGOs which are really independent and not financed by the government otherwise. Maybe just a short comment about the question regarding the difference between East and West. I would hope, and I would argue that the difference is mostly within societies and also within Hungary. And it is not Viktor Orban and his way of thinking who proclaims to be the representative of Central Europe as such. And he even started a sort of counter-revolution against the West, arguing that we know it better from Central Europe because of our tradition, forgetting other Hungarian and Central or Eastern European traditions or ideologies or philosophies or philosophers. There is an alternative even inside Hungary compared to Orban. So I think it's an ongoing struggle or fight within our society, not only between two political camps, but also between ideological, philosophical traditions, European and anti-European values. So I'm more optimistic. We are not so far from the West, and we shouldn't create something, again, a box for ourselves, but we belong to the EU.
István, Denis, any final short comment, please?
Yeah, I think that we really have to deal with the methodological criticism that we have received today, and I believe that we should focus on institutions rather than people, because people are coming and living. So, and in NGOs, you have also the problem of external dependence or the dependence on external donations and funds, and then you cannot simply rely on the same people every time, even if it's 2 years, in a distance of 2 years.
It's also a small world, so there aren't many other people that will be able to answer.
Yeah, but you have universities, you have other institutions. So in my view, I think that you have also donor institutions that are stable. They have people who work exactly with these issues, and you can dig into the details and flesh out those names that are relevant. Yeah, I know. I have the same challenge. And then the second thing, which I really believe it's important, and I know that you have paid attention to that, but I would like to have it even more emphasized, is that we need to look at which are the triggers. The critical junctures are very important, and there should be an open question about what are the triggers that were important for the specific country in a certain amount of years. And then you'll have this exactly qualitative answers that you can use and develop in order to make even more sense out of the observations that are clear-cut in what you have presented today.
Dani, beyond the fact that I think with the earlier question as well, I think there's a lot of expectation that we can offer not just the what, but the how, and then the path forward, and so on. And I will say, well, I think we're more modest in our ambitions. For now, we would like to offer the snapshot. What you do with it, and other stakeholders, that I'm afraid is not our business. But beyond that, final comments.
That's exactly the thing, and in a way, I'm very glad that we did get quite a bit of pushback, because it basically shows that a lot of people want a lot of stuff from this kind of work, which means that there's room for it, there's a need for it, and because there's a need for it, it doesn't have to be. We don't have to do everything. Hopefully someone will come along and start doing some of the additional things. Someone will come along and start looking at the critical junctures. Or maybe we'll do a bigger endeavor and start looking at the critical junctures as well. But the thing is that I believe that we are bringing some useful, important information to the table. We're bringing a process that allows people who are interested to follow exactly what happens in a comprehensive framework in these countries. I think that's useful. It could definitely be perfected. We're very much open to ideas and suggestions of how it can be perfected. We already spent a lot of time trying to do that. And actually, one of Clara's comments is very illustrative of the problems that we might have, the fact that we don't necessarily have that continuity of experts, but just like in any sort of a panel investigation, because this is what we're envisioning here, there is some attrition that can't be avoided, but as long as the attrition is not too large, you can still consider the results as the sort of a fixed effects model. Communists' melancholy. Right, very, very brief. It's not communist melancholy, it's basically the idea that the past 100, 150 years of one society has a major influence on what exactly it is that people within that society will be doing. So in Romania and Hungary and Moldova, we framed it as communist melancholy, or that's how it was interpreted. But generally, it's talk about non-democratic traditions or legacies within the last 100, 150 years. If it had been applied in Greece, it would have been the military junta. If it had been applied in Portugal, it would have been Salazar, and so on and so on. This idea that historical legacies can affect what exactly it is that institutions work like and that people work like. How to create change through this? Very briefly, I promise. Basically, just give instruments to people who are seeing some vulnerabilities, some sort of risk within their countries or countries that they're looking at. Give them information, give them the ammo necessary to lead this fight that is towards building up this democratic resilience. And in the end, why is it that we want democracy to endure? I think that's a question a bit above my pay grade, but I like to think of the veil of ignorance. Basically says if you don't know exactly where it is that you're going to be born, what kind of country would you want to be born in? Would you want to be born in a country that is democratic, or would you want to be born in a country that is not so democratic? And if If everybody's choice is that they want to be born in a country that's democratic, then we guess we have a normative reason to strive to give that kind of political model.
Thank you, Dani. Since I have no final thoughts, Costin, I give you 30 seconds to say the final word because you're also part of the team, but please make it short.
Yeah, so I find the last question very interesting because I think we should start from that question. There's currently a trade-off between liberal values and democracy, and we see the emergence of an alternative model. So we tend to focus on aggregate levels and benefits of democracy. But even in Eastern Europe, we see the proliferation of an alternative narrative, and this is pushed by various actors. Just there are some people who say I would prefer prosperity, even if I need to give up to some civil rights and liberties. We see this idea of just economic patriotism, about colonialism, economic colonialism in Eastern Europe, a certain kind of emergence of an alternative values that are pushed by various actors, and we know who's doing that in Eastern Europe. There are people who are left behind, and we need to investigate more what are the drivers of the attitudes of those people, because those people end up voting for populist parties, and those people are not represented by the system, and then you see some certain kind of critical juncture. So it's important. This kind of index can do a lot, and it has shown that it's important to look at what's important for political leaders, but also what could constrain the behavior of leaders. And if you look at what constrains the political leaders, you need to look at the population and more at their values and how this kind of values emerge. So thank you for being part of the project, and it would be very interesting to complement this kind of initiative with others that could offer a more holistic perspective on democratic resilience in Central Eastern Europe and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the entire team, the visible and the invisible one, and thank you for daring to come to an in-person event, as well as to those who have been online with us. And we are easy to find. Anytime you have further questions or input, we'll still be working on that, I'm afraid, for many years to come. Thank you very much.